Our moderator today is Lisa McGuire, CEO of the Manufacturing Safety Alliance of BC. Welcome, Lisa.
Thanks, Shirley, and welcome, everyone. I'm honored to be joining you from the Fraser Valley office of the Manufacturing Safety Alliance of BC. Located in Chilliwack, residing on the traditional and unceded territories of the Stolo Coast Salish people. We are grateful for the opportunity to speak to you and share in our discussions on a very important topic from these shared lands today. For those who don't know us, the Manufacturing Safety Alliance is a not-for-profit health and safety association for manufacturers and food processes in BC. We are committed to helping organizations transform their health and safety culture through effective systems, training, resources, and certification. We have a team of experts dedicated to supporting you in health and safety, whether it be to navigate health and safety regulations or achieving core certification branded OSI, the Occupational Safety Standard of Excellence for manufacturing. Please call on us anytime for assistance with health and safety training, information, advice, or resources. Thank you all for joining us for today's webinar on bullying and harassment. Today is Pink Shirt Day. On this Canada-wide Anti-Bullying Day, we stand together against bullying and through our collective actions work to create a world where we can work, live, and play, where we are valued for who we are and the rich diversity we bring as unique individuals. Bullying comes in many forms, and today we will learn more about how recognizing what it can look like, how it affects the people in our organizations and lives, and what we can do to stop it. Pink Shirt Day came to life in 2007, when a 9th grade student in Nova Scotia was being bullied for wearing a pink polo shirt on his first day of school. 2 12th grade students saw this happen, and through their incredible acts of leadership, bought and distributed 50 pink shirts the next day, spurring this annual event that symbolizes the importance of speaking out against bullying. But bullying doesn't just happen in schools or in the classroom. It can also happen at work or online. Workplace bullying and harassment, intended or not, can create a toxic work environment that makes our workplaces mentally and physically unsafe. It can result in violence-related injuries, can disrupt work and reduce efficiency and productivity, and it can have a lasting negative impact on morale within your company and your reputation as an employer. In 2022, a joint study by the Canadian Labour Congress, University of Western Ontario, and the University of Toronto found that 7 in 10 workers have experienced some form of harassment and violence at work. This is hard to believe, 70%. And unacceptable. What can we do about this? And what are our legal and moral responsibilities for stopping bullying and harassment in the workplace as employers, managers, or co-workers? To answer these questions and more, we have Dr. Steve Conway, the Mental Health and Wellness Director here at the Alliance, to share his insight into this important topic. Thank you for joining us, Steve.
Hi, Lisa. It's great to be here.
Before Steve begins, I'd like to remind our attendees that you may ask questions at any time using the Q&A during the session. We'll address as many of these questions as we can at the end of the hour. Steve, please get us started.
Thanks, Lisa. Well, hello, everybody. It's great to be here on Pink Shirt Day. I'm really happy that, so many people have taken the opportunity to come and learn more about this. So just like one caveat, really what we're going to be providing today is a pretty high level overview of bullying and harassment in the workplace. And this is not really intended to take the place of more formalized training. So, when we think about the modern workplace, one thing is we have to start thinking about civility and respect. So everybody has the right to go to work feeling safe and respected by those they work with. Everybody. When people are treated with respect, they enjoy greater well-being and are able to contribute to their workplace, family, and community. Unfortunately, as Lisa pointed out with those really staggering numbers, Unfortunately, not all people experience a respectful workplace, and some people are bullied and harassed at work. Now, obviously, we cannot, of course, know everything that is going to hurt somebody. So that is why it's up to the receiver and how they respond to what we said, which should serve as our guide. So always important to keep in mind, the absence of malicious intent does not justify inappropriate behavior. Things like, oh, I didn't mean it. I was just kidding. Learn to take a joke, for example. Importantly and key, the perception of the receiver is the gauge, and we must value their perception of what just occurred. But when we're talking about, why this is important, this is about protection for employees. And there is legislation in place to provide this protection. So we have human rights legislation that prohibits discrimination, including harassment. We have occupational health and safety legislation that prohibits harassment of employees. We have the Workers' Compensation Act. For example, we have company policy that prohibits discrimination and harassment. We have multiple layers of protection in the form of legislation and policy to ensure that an environment, a workplace, is free of bullying and harassment. Canadian Human Rights has legislation and the definitions that they look at. So if you think about what discrimination is, discrimination means treating certain individuals or groups differently based on a prohibited ground of discrimination. So discrimination can take the form of harassment. And when we're thinking about what are these groups that we're talking about, for example, ethnicity, age, gender, including gender identification, disability, religion, family status, sexual orientation, to name but a few. When we talk about harassment, harassment is defined as any unwelcome physical or verbal conduct that offends, humiliates, or insults or degrades you. We talk about unwelcome. That is actually any actions which the harasser knows or reasonably ought to know are not wanted by the victim of harassment. And I think, reasonably ought to know, we're talking about a standard of behavior, a norm of behavior that, arguably has changed over time. But when you think about, what is bullying and harassment? Oh, hello, Lisa.
Hi, Steve. Thanks for sharing the information so far. So what does workplace bullying and harassment look like compared to 5 or even 10 years ago? We know that times have changed, and you mentioned some of that, and that things that may have written off as a funny joke before aren't acceptable anymore. Someone tells a joke that crosses some of these lines you have shared in your presentation. Would that be considered harassment, even if the person might actually find it funny? Can you help us navigate the boundaries between humor and harassment in that context?
Well, and this is where it can get tricky, and this is where confusion can come into play. And, the workplace has changed significantly. When I think about, when I started working, 35 years ago, the things that were said, the jokes that were made, the comments that flew around were, by that standard, they were commonplace. But if we look at them through the lens of today, a great deal of what I experienced and what I saw, and to be honest, what I also participated back then unknowingly, would qualify as harassment today or discrimination today. So we have to think about, sometimes we get trapped in thinking about the way it used to be. We have to look at what it's like now. And you mentioned about, jokes. And sometimes, and usually jokes are the form that a lot of harassment takes, or bullying, because people use the excuse, I was just kidding. And really, whether people think it's funny is really not the issue, because a joke that can be perceived as funny, by some individuals is considered harassment if it's causing harm to other individuals. So it's not necessarily about the receiver of that joke, who might laugh along for a variety of reasons. Some of those reasons might not because they think it's funny. But what about the individuals who are observing and watching and seeing that? They might feel that that's discriminatory or harassment. So we have to think about the broader context and the people in that environment.
Thanks, Steve.
But if we think about what it is, what does it look like? It looks like a lot of things, and arguably, it looks like it's changed over time. But really, if we think of it in its most basic form, bullying and harassment includes any behavior that humiliates or intimidates individuals, including those of a sexual nature. We're talking about, personal attacks, verbal aggression, yelling at somebody, name calling, belittling people, offensive jokes at the expense of others. It can look like spreading malicious rumors, right? Knowingly spreading falsehoods about an individual that are meant to cause that person harm. It can be about isolating somebody socially, giving that person the silent treatment, treating them like they're not there. It can look like vandalizing or damaging somebody's personal belongings. It could be something like, breaking into their locker, keying their car. It could be stealing their lunch in the company, in the staff room fridge. Obviously, we're talking about behavior that's aggressive or threatening gestures, raising your hand to somebody, for example, unwanted touching, including touching, that is patting, pinching, or punching people, obviously. Anytime your hand touches somebody without getting their permission. Displaying sexist, racist, or other offensive pictures and posters, there are still environments where you will see these posted. Now we live in a new world, in a world that I'm not as into social media as some people, but we see a lot of bullying now takes place over social media. So we see it cyberbullying, for example, or it can be playing music with offensive or vulgar language in it, which is going to, upset or insult somebody else. It can be about sabotaging work or overloading an individual with work where it's really unrealistic for that person to be able to achieve it, or setting unrealistic deadlines. So it's really hard. Bullying and harassment looks like many, many different things. But what we're really talking about is behavior, whether it's intentional or not, that causes harm to another individual. When we have examples like this, what we're doing is we're really eroding psychological safety. We're making it feel unsafe and dangerous for people to go to work. And when you think about it, we spend at least 60% of our waking time as adults at work. And there are people who will say, it's all in good fun. But when we think about the impact that it has, which I'm going to talk about a little bit later, you will see that it's not about fun at all. And, most of us hopefully have left junior high a long, long time ago. But I often get asked, so, is bullying harassment? When my boss tells me that I have to do a job or he gives me direction, that's bullying, right? I'm being harassed, right? Not necessarily. If we think about bullying and harassment and what it is not bullying and harassment to express differences of opinion or offering constructive feedback. Remember, we've got to think about also, basing it with civility and respect. It's not when we make a legitimate complaint about another worker's conduct. Bullying and harassment is not reasonable management actions, including decisions about, job duties and the work to be performed, workloads and deadlines, layoffs, transfers, promotions, and reorganizations. Bullying and harassment is not work instruction, supervision, or feedback. It's not work evaluation or performance management or discipline, suspensions, or terminations. So as an employer, as managers, there's a responsibility, that we have to the organization and also to guide people on our team. That does not constitute bullying and harassment. What is bullying and harassment, if these things are done, if we go back to some of that, the previous slide, with those behaviors added into it. But why is it important? Oh, Lisa's back. Hi, Lisa.
Yeah, no, and thank you. I'm sure that you have many examples from the work you've done in helping companies build a stronger culture. Would you be able to share more about how bullying and harassment impacts employees and employers? And then going back to the question I asked at the beginning, what are the responsibilities of employers, managers, and supervisors if bullying and harassment does exist? And you kind of shared the difference there between the two.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're going to touch on all of those in coming up, but when we think about the impact, bullying and harassment, again, it doesn't just impact the individual who's being bullied and harassed. It impacts that person's family. It impacts that person's community. It impacts the employer. It impacts the company. It impacts possibly the clientele or the customer base. bullying and harassment, we often think it's an isolated behavior that targets one individual, but we really see its negative and damaging effects that permeate across the organization and across the community. So it's really important to be aware of these things because of the damage it does. And I think, Lisa, you mentioned earlier on that it's toxic.
Yes.
And bullying harassment actually, it is toxic. It's toxic to our sense of morale, our sense of engagement. It also makes us sick. When an employee is bullied and harassed, they become physically and emotionally unwell. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what those things look like. So if we think about why is it important and what it looks like, it looks like a number of different things. And different people will probably be affected in different ways, but it's safe to assume that, if bullying harassment is present, one or more of these things will occur. So obviously, disrespectful workplaces produce acute stress. If it's prolonged, it's chronic stress. And what we know that when people are subjected to stress for too long, it makes you sick. The stress hormones, for example, that stream through our bodies have an impact on our immune system. It creates, heart disease, for example, and it can actually exacerbate or develop into mental health disorders. So we know it causes real physical and psychological harm when we're overly stressed. Again, it creates health and safety issues. And people say, well, how can, somebody being picked on or bullied, how can that create safety issues? Well, first of all, what it can do is it can lead, when people are engaging in bullying and harassing behavior, they're not paying attention to the work they're supposed to be doing, right? It also, if we have hazing or that kind of behavior, that creates a safety risk. But think of it from the term of the individual who's being bullied or harassed. When they're exposed to that kind of treatment, that toxic treatment, and they're flooded with stress hormone, they're preoccupied, they're not able to focus on their job effectively. And if they're in a safety sensitive position, that means they and their colleagues are at higher risk of accident and injury because that person is unable to focus effectively on what they're doing because they're being bullied and harassed. Again, it's about distracting someone who's performing dangerous tasks, like I just mentioned. It takes that person's eye off the ball. I talked about the physical and psychological injury. And again, bullying and harassment, sometimes it can be physical violence that occurs, but often as well, it's the psychological injury. It creates psychological harm, and it creates a workplace that is not psychologically safe. So we see people trying to engage in avoidance behaviors, for example, and it makes sense. They want to avoid being harmed. We see people who, are not in tune, not engaged, not focusing on the tasks at hand. If they've got depression or anxiety, it's more likely to exacerbate that, or it could lead to that if they're, the victims of bullying and harassment. We know that it causes, in an organization that has bullying and harassment that's not being addressed, that organization's their employees will have lower morale and engagement. People will not feel safe. They will not feel seen. They will not feel cared for. And they will not feel the same kind of organizational citizenship towards the organization as if they would if they were in a place where they felt psychologically safe. So, and we already know that engagement's a huge issue. If you look at some of the Gallup research that was done, during even before and during COVID, we have huge staggering numbers of individuals who are not engaged in their work. If you had the impact of bullying and harassment, those numbers go down even more. People just do not feel engaged in that environment because it's not safe. When we see that as well, we know that companies have lower productivity and profitability. There's a real business case to be made for a company and for an organization to proactively tackle bullying and harassment in the environment for no other reason than for the return on investment that it provides. I mentioned the avoidance behavior, right? When people are being harassed and picked on and bullied, it's a stressful environment, and when they feel that they're not being backed up or given support by the organization or their employee, it makes sense that they're going to call in more often. They're going to call in sick. They're going to try to avoid work, right? Because they're trying to avoid that harassment that's occurring for them. It's a very understandable reaction. And obviously what we see then when we have an organization, word spreads. sometimes people like to think, well, it's an isolated event, and sometimes, often what we think is an isolated event often means that there's other issues going on. And people talk about, this organization, people are getting bullied and harassed all the time. It will be far harder to keep employees in an environment like that. They're gonna vote with their feet and they're gonna leave. But word also spreads, and recruiting becomes difficult for an organization like that as well, because people will hear that this place is not safe. It is not a safe place for me to go. And we're already seeing in manufacturing how hard it is to recruit talent. So again, another reason to be very mindful on an organizational level to tackle bullying and harassment in that workplace. And so many consumers now are socially minded. There's a social justice lens that consumers have. And many people will, again, vote with their dollars, vote with their spending, and they will avoid investing in, purchasing from, being involved with companies that have a reputation for not looking after their employees, for organizations that allow bullying and harassment to go unchecked. And obviously, there's legal issues. Employers have a legal responsibility to ensure that bullying and harassment does not occur, or to, make every reasonable effort to stop it from happening. So again, so many reasons for, organizations to tackle this problem head on. So, and sometimes people say, well, it's the owner's responsibility, it's the supervisor, it's the employees. When it comes to bullying and harassment and, reducing it and eliminating it, every person in the organization plays a part. Everybody, the employers, the managers, and the employees, every one of them must play a role, modeling and ensuring civil and respectful behavior. Just having a policy statement isn't enough if it's not put into action. So what do you mean? Everybody plays a part? Like I said, absolutely everybody. So we're going to cover, the main players in an organization about what they need to be doing as part of preventing bullying and harassment. So obviously, we have the employer. The employer has specific obligations. So first of all, again, draft a workplace policy statement. Again, it might sound very simple, but what that does is it signals an intent. It signals that an organization, that an employer sees this as important, and it communicates this importance through that statement to stakeholders, managers, employees, and customers. Employers have an obligation to prevent or minimize bullying and harassment. And, prevention is always preferred, to reacting to an incident that's already occurring. So that organization, if they need to put in policies and practices to prevent it from happening, or at the very least ensure that when it does happen, it's addressed and minimized quickly. The employer has to put in, reporting procedures, develop reporting procedures that are known and accessible to employees, so that they know that exists and they know that there's structures in place to support them if they are being bullied and harassed. The employer has a responsibility to develop procedures for dealing with and investigating incidents or complaints. So if it's brought up to you, the employer has to take specific actions to investigate what's occurred. The employer also has an obligation to ensure that all workers and supervisors are aware of the policy, are aware of the reporting procedures, and are aware about what bullying and harassment is in the workplace. So training is an essential obligation for employers. So we think about, developing a policy statement, there's a number of ways you can do it, but bullying and harassment is not acceptable or tolerated in this workplace. All workers will be treated fairly and with respect. As a workplace, create a policy statement that workplace bullying is unacceptable and not tolerated. And this policy statement should be reviewed annually, and all employees must be aware of it. Again, if it's a well-intentioned statement, but it's collecting dust in a manual and nobody sees it, it doesn't really have any weight. It doesn't have any power. these things that for a policy statement to be the most effective, it has to be visible by all, hopefully stakeholders, and that means employees as well as supervisors and employers have a role in developing it, but everybody looks at it. And when we think about changing norms, changing, workplaces are becoming far more diverse than they ever were, things change. And so, a policy statement should be a living policy statement, which means it should be reviewed and renewed annually if it needs to be. Don't just leave it on a shelf to collect dust. Employers, again, have a responsibility for dealing with incidents or complaints. So this means a number of important things. Investigations will be conducted internally, right? So when we know something happens, the employer is obligated to investigate. The investigation will be undertaken promptly and diligently. So it means we don't just wait. We don't wait and hope that the problem goes away. Avoidance is a terrible business approach. It's a terrible approach for dealing with this issue. If when it happens, it has to be done soon. It has to be done imminently and immediately. And it has to be done diligently. So it means it has to be done by somebody who has a level of training and understanding about how to engage in these kind of investigations. It has to be sensitive to the interests of all parties involved and maintain confidentiality. During the investigation phase, it's important to keep in mind that, the alleged perpetrator, still has not been, until that investigation is complete, we can't say that that person's actually done anything. So that the investigation has to take its place. It has to play out. During that process, though, it's critical to maintain confidentiality for the sake of the victim and also for the sake of the perpetrator or the alleged perpetrator. So confidentiality is extremely important. The alleged bully and the alleged target will be advised of the investigation findings. So once it's completed, all parties will know what the outcome is. And then finally, appropriate corrective action will be taken place within a reasonable time frame. There's that saying, justice delayed is justice denied. We want to make sure that we're, essentially striking while the iron's hot and dealing with it as soon as we know what the outcome is. It's also really important to comment here as well that, an employee who has come forward and said, I'm being bullied and harassed, that takes a great deal of courage. And that employee must also be reassured that they will be protected from retribution, right? Because if we have a situation where somebody comes forward and that leads to further bullying and harassment, what that does is it dampens down, hopes for anybody else. People will stop coming forward. And then the environment can become extraordinarily toxic and rampant with bullying and abuse if we're not careful. So these are the employer's responsibilities. So managers have a role as well. It's critical for managers to know and comply with company policy. They need to communicate and enforce that policy with employees, visitors, customers, and contractors. And I've been in some environments where I've actually, inquired about when the last time even managers have looked at their company policy. And, it's not an uncommon thing for people to say, I don't think I've ever seen it, or I can't remember the last time I looked at it. Again, when we think about what the legal ramifications are of not dealing with it, knowing your policy is critical. Knowing your policy ensures that you are actually, and policy should be based on legislative requirements. Following policy is like your lighthouse. It's like your lighthouse in a storm. It keeps you going in the right direction. You're not going to be effective at enforcing policy if you don't know what it is. A manager has to intervene to prevent harassment if they witness inappropriate behavior. That can be a scary thing to do. It can be frightening to confront somebody, So that's where training comes in. That's where support of the organization comes in to provide that backup to the manager. We have to challenge harassment when it occurs. Again, avoidance never makes a problem go away. It just allows it to fester and get bigger. Some organizations might not have, might be big enough to have HR, but if you are, inform HR of any complaints or the individual in your organization who assumes that role. It's no secret, managers also participate in bullying and harassment, so part of it is like, how do we train and how do we select those for management roles? Because they have to refuse to participate in that harassment and not partake in it. I mentioned earlier that, managers have to ensure that employees who complain or participate in investigations are protected from retribution, that they know that they can come forward and they will be kept safe. Managers need to ensure all harassment complaints are investigated promptly and confidentially, just like the employers do. As a manager, it's also really important, like I said, what harassment, bullying harassment is not, in the regular duties of a manager is to direct and provide feedback to employees. But sometimes how that direction is given can cross the line into bullying and harassment. So a manager really has to understand how others are perceiving their behaviors and their actions. That manager has to offer support to the harassed staff. Make sure that that harassed individual is, their concerns are taken seriously. If you have an EAP program, refer them to an EAP program, refer them to a community resource if they need that, but let them know you see them and you're supporting them. And managers, while they can be harassed, they can also be the targets of harassment. So as a manager, if you're being harassed, you have to notify the appropriate people if you're harassed yourself. So again, part of that is also about, setting, being a role model. When you're a manager, people look up to you to guide their behavior. Management doesn't come easy. It's not an easy gig. There's a lot of responsibilities that come with it. And the more you know and the more trained you are in dealing with it, the easier it's going to be, which is, easy for a difficult situation. But the employees, they're not off the hook either. The employees also have to participate in ensuring that an environment is free from harassment and bullying. And, some of these things will be very similar. They need to know and comply. So know and comply with company policy regarding harassment. And, I've worked in environments where every year we had to do compliance training. And every year, there would be the grumbling that comes along with it. But it's very important, if we want to keep something alive in people's minds, they have to be re-exposed to it. We have to think about new employees that are coming on when they're being onboarded. That should be a key part of their onboarding process. We think about gossip. It can be very easy to get caught up into gossip, about talking about other people who aren't in the room. And gossip is rarely ever positive. We're not usually, when we're talking about gossip, we're not usually saying, hey, that Steve guy, he's such a good employee, he's really great. No, we're usually saying other negative, pejorative things about Steve, unfortunately. So don't participate in that gossip about a colleague or a supervisor. It can be hard to do. But if you're in that environment and you don't know what to do, if you don't feel comfortable or confident saying, you know what, this isn't okay, at the very least, remove yourself from the situation, at the very least. Because we also have to keep in mind that people, come with varying degrees of comfort, varying degrees of confidence, or skill and ability, and in their ability to intervene. At the very, very least, if you're not going to, confront, step back and don't participate. And for all the gossiper, sometimes we think, gossip it can be funny, but the person who's gossiping, if you're with somebody and they're gossiping about somebody else, you got to think, when I'm not in the room, is that person gossiping about me? Probably. And the gossiper themselves, nobody trusts the gossiper because we all know what they're about. So gossiping leads to a toxic environment. Again, contribute to making the workplace free from harassment. It means being aware of the policy. It means knowing the mission statement. It means supporting individuals, in the environment who might be harassed. It means not participating. It means creating an environment where people are treated with civility and respect, an environment where everybody wants to be. Intervene if you witness the behavior. This can be challenging. I'm not going to admit that intervening is an easy thing to do. Again, like I said, if you don't feel comfortable doing it, talk to your manager, talk to HR, approach the victim afterwards and say, I saw that. What support do you need from me? I already mentioned about informing your manager or HR. Again, refuse to participate. and sometimes I've been, people said, I wasn't doing anything, but they were there. You were, the person was there listening, laughing, just being there and laughing or not removing yourself from the situation, in essence, is colluding with the problem, right? So if you're not going to confront, walk away and don't participate. Be very mindful, right? About your own actions, and check if there's anything in your behavior that might offend or, humiliate someone else. As I said, 35 years ago, the working world was a very different place. The things that were said and done then, even by myself, would not fly nowadays. And so it's been a learning curve, for me to, over the years, to step back and say, is what I'm saying okay? And realizing, what, it wasn't okay, and it's not okay. It takes a little bit of humility to do that, and it can make one feel rather somewhat uncomfortable. But I always say, lean into the discomfort, because again, if you're not willing to look at, some of your behaviors and practices, the bullying and harassment won't go away. None of us are perfect, right? We're talking about how do we make it better, and we don't make it better, like I said, by avoiding. And really, when somebody is being harassed, the employees rally around that person. Let them know that they are seen. Let them know that they are valued, and let them know that you will support them. That creates a psychologically safe community. And, what do we do, if there is a bully? And this is not an easy one to deal with. And, so often people say, so Steve, what do I do? If they give me a situation, I'll say, well, it kind of depends. Depends on a lot of factors, but there are some things that are really important to do. If you are the target, or if you witness to people being bullied and harassed, first thing, and it takes courage, and it's hard, and it's not easy, and I struggle with this, but courage isn't the absence of fear. Courage is feeling the fear and doing it anyway. So summon that courage, master that fear, and tell that bully that the behavior is inappropriate. In a sense, what you're saying is, I see you. I've seen what you've done. Bullies, some of them like the audience, but they also, bullying and harassment thrives in dark corners when people don't see it. And by the act of seeing it and the act of saying, hey, I'm calling you out on that, that will, in many cases, that will make a bully back down. And make it clear that the behavior is unwanted and unacceptable. So some people will say, well, I didn't know it was a problem. Nobody said anything. And that I've heard that before. And, yeah, that can sometimes make it tricky. If you're the victim of it, or if you see it, that you need to say, this is inappropriate. I don't like this. I don't appreciate this. I don't want you to engage in this behavior anymore. It's important to stay calm. When we're the victims of it, or when we see it, all sorts of funny things can happen with us. We can actually start to get upset, reactive. And, if we're reacting, escalating to the point that the bully is, nothing positive comes from that. We need to stay calm when we're confronting the situation. We don't want to be throwing gasoline onto the fire. There's a saying, I can't remember where it comes from. I plagiarize a lot of sayings. None of them are mine. If you think about which fish gets eaten, it's the fish that bites the hook. None of us want to be the fish that's on the dinner plate. So really what that means is, when you're in a situation that's stressful, or you feel like you're being treated unfairly or harassed, staying calm is the best thing that you can do. Don't escalate it. Importantly, don't retaliate, right? Because your retaliation, that will also be bullying and harassment. It doesn't matter who it's being directed at. The behavior is still wrong. So don't retaliate. Instead, report it. But this stuff is hard to do, and it takes courage. But if we don't step up, bullying and harassment will take root, and it won't go away. And we'll end up with a working environment that's toxic for everybody. But, people being what they are, we are not perfect. And I've worked for, 30 years working with people from all sorts of situations. And it's surprising how many people think that they are on the perfect side. But I'll tell you, they're often, I've never met anybody yet. So keep in mind with some humility that sometimes we unintentionally say or do something that offends another, right? Most of the time when this happens, we're not doing it on purpose. We're certainly not doing it intentionally. But when we are called out on that behavior, we need to take that seriously. We need to hear the individual who is saying, hey, Steve, that was not okay. So if you have caused offense and somebody calls you or you realize it later, stop the problematic behavior right away. Just stop it, right? Don't dig a deeper hole by continuing it. Attempt to understand the other person's point of view. What is their perception? How did that person experience what you said or did? By not asking or not trying to understand, you won't really develop an understanding about what the behavior is and why it's not okay. And sometimes what happens is when we do this, we start arguing about, the truth. Well, that's not what happened. I didn't do that. Truth has got nothing to do with it. What we're talking about is perception. And if we go back earlier on, it's the perception of the receiver that is the gauge of whether our behavior was okay or not. Listen to that person. When we're in a room, learn to read that room. It's part of being emotionally intelligent. If I say or do something, pay attention to what other people's reactions are. If I'm seeing, verbal and nonverbal behavior, which is suggesting something, check it out. Simply say, I'm noticing a reaction. Have I caused you offense? Very simple like that. Importantly, like I said earlier, don't bite the hook. Don't become defensive. Because what happens when we become defensive, our ears close and our mouths tend to open. We want to be mindful that we've got 2 ears and 1 mouth, so it's time to listen twice as much as we talk. Be curious and open, and don't feel the need to defend yourself, right? It's what happened, and try to understand it. And, consider, and sometimes people say, what do you mean consider an authentic apology? Well, I'm a big believer, if you've done something wrong and you really mean the apology, then I'm a big fan of saying it, because people can smell a disingenuous apology from a mile away. I'm sorry, but is really not saying you're sorry at all. So if you can apologize in an authentic way, do it. If you need some time to reflect, that's okay. And you realize it, come and do it later. It's quite amazing. Sometimes something will happen and, reflect on it and go, you know what? Now that I think about it, I was wrong. It never hurts to go back a day, 2 days, it doesn't matter, and say, you know what? I realized what had happened and I apologize for that. And sometimes, we just can't do it on it. Sometimes we butt heads, seek a third party, seek assistance from your supervisor or HR to resolve the issue. Sometimes having a third set of eyes in there, a third perspective, can really help, make the issue go away or resolve that issue. So, this is about having humility and knowing that none of us are perfect and we will slip up along the way. The idea is to identify it and really proactively go about understanding and changing your behavior. So thank you. That's the end of the high level bullying and harassment lecture. It's, again, not intended to be a formal training, but just to give you some higher level perspective. And again, if there are any questions, feel free to reach out to me.
Thank you so much, Steve. It's fantastic to be able to tap into your expertise in this area. And really now inviting questions from the audience through the Q&A. We'll address as many as we can before the hour is up, and I see some coming in. We've had a couple come in prior to the session today. Sometimes bullying may be intentional. What can a person do to respond if you don't have a formal HR person, or if the bully is friends with the owner? Any insight into that question, Steve?
Yeah, and again, it can be really challenging. We're in an environment where, smaller environments in particular can be challenging. The advice, again, if you're experiencing it, again, say something. If it's happening, we can't always assume that the other person knows that they're being a bully. Often they do, but we can't always assume it. So you have to say something. If you don't feel safe going to the employer because maybe it's a friend or a relative, then I would recommend going to WorkSafe BC and reaching out to them, because that's what they can support with that process. But yeah, very, very difficult.
So aligned to that question, if an employee misses work due to a bullying and harassment, does this not also trigger a WorkSafe BC claim?
I believe it. Yes, actually, I believe it can. And just before I say 100%, yes, it can do that. Again, we have to be very mindful about the impacts of doing this, of engaging in bullying and harassment. It creates harm. And so if you're not addressing it, it creates every possibility that WorkSafe BC will be.
Okay, hopefully you can still hear me.
I can hear you now.
It just froze. I don't know if it's the weather or let me just click back on the camera. It just disappeared. Sorry. My apologies. Okay. In the interest of time, making sure I go to the next question. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between harassment and discrimination?
So
Steve, you're frozen. We'll just give us a little bit. Oh, we've lost Steve. So just hang tight. Hopefully he'll jump back in quickly. It's blustery weather here out in Chilliwack. So hopefully that's not the case. And there's been a technical challenge. Oh, are you back? Thanks, Steve.
I'm back for right now.
Okay.
So sorry, where were we? I think I heard you say, what's the difference between bullying and harassment? Did I hear that?
The difference between bullying, discrimination.
So if we go.
So harassment and discrimination. Oh, and you're frozen again. Oh my goodness. Well, making sure that we collect all the questions and get them certainly
targeting them for their personal characteristics.
Okay, sorry, we might have to start from the top because we lost you again.
Technology.
Yes.
So again, now discrimination. So we're talking about discrimination. Yep. Okay. So discrimination is when certain individuals or groups are targeted because of their personal defining characteristic. Targeting.
Sorry, Steve, you're back again, but you're kind of in and out. All we can do is kind of work through the technological, the blips.
Well, hopefully the really questions are when.
Yes, I mean, we will collect all your questions, so please continue to put them in. If you have them, we'll ensure that Steve answers every one and we will get them back to you. So really appreciate your time today, Steve, and sorry, all of you for the technical glitch that we live in at times happens to all of us. So thank you for your patience. Thank you once again for joining us today. And Steve is helping us recognize where bullying and harassment are happening and what we can do to respond to keep our people healthy and safe, both physically and mentally. Creating a world where we can all feel safe starts with each of us, and we all have a role to play. To everyone in the audience, thank you for joining us and sharing your questions. Once again, we will make sure that we get answers for you and share them in the follow-up. If you're joining us from the interior, I'm excited to invite you to join us in Kelowna on April the 21st for Make It Safe Live in the Okanagan, the region's new health and safety conference, a prequel to our Make It Safe conference in the fall. This one-day health and safety conference will cover relevant topics for the industries in your area. Watch for registration to open very soon at makeitsafe.ca. And of course, save the date for the 2023 Safety Pinnacle Awards Gala on June the 8th in Surrey. We can't wait to recognize your company, your teams and leaders for the work you're doing to inspire and strengthen health and safety in your companies and communities. We hope you can all join us that evening to celebrate the industry's health and safety successes. Once again, visit us online anytime for training or assistance and to access our library of webinars and resources. Watch for an email tomorrow with a link to the recording of today's session and a survey link to share your feedback. Once again, thanks for your understanding today and attending. Take care.